Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm glad that you have come. We want to give a special welcome to Mary's mom. Glad that you're able to join us today. Today's message is part 11 in our study of the book of Ecclesiastes. There's a number of things that he has already taught us. The preacher has taught us that life is meaningless. It is a cursed world in which God is using the meaninglessness of the world to draw people to himself. He has taught us that God has given meaningless each meaningless day to us as a gift in which we can find joy if we learn to trust in him and him alone. He has taught us that life is unpredictable, yet God is in control and knows what is best for us. He is the sovereign king who has planned everything that happens in order to accomplish all of his eternal decrees. He's also taught us that life is unfair. Good and bad comes to both the righteous and the wicked, and we are to trust God and find joy in every circumstance of life and to please God. If you remember in that message, I introduced to you again the statement that I've often said, from circumstance to circumstance, God is always in control. Another thing that he has taught us is that life is full of wickedness. The young and the old, and is full of wickedness. And we are to trust God that even the wickedness is part of his plan, and we are to find joy in every situation. He has also taught us that death comes to everyone, to the young and to the old, to the wicked, to the righteous. We do not know what will happen each day of our lives, but we do know that they are in the hands of God. For those who trust God, there is hope beyond death that brings joy to life. Now, one of the common denominators in all of these lessons is joy. And we see that in the phrases where he tells us to eat and drink and to find enjoyment in the things that God has given to us. And that's not a giving up. It's not the philosophy of the world, which is eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. But it is a philosophy of being able to adapt within a world of meaninglessness. And we're to have joy. We're to find joy in every circumstance that comes in our life. Now, our message today is going to introduce some more aspects to that joy. And so I've titled my message this morning, Morning Joy. So morning not in sadness, but morning as in the morning versus evening. So in the morning, there comes joy. So today we begin a look at the last part of the second message that the preacher gives to us on how to live in this meaningless world. So have your Bibles open to Ecclesiastes chapter 9. And beginning at verse 11, he starts this last section, and it goes all the way through to verse 6 of chapter 11. So from 9:11 through to 11:6. And there the preacher draws a number of conclusions about messages that he has already taught us, and he summarizes those teachings with some other illustrations and parables. Now, this section breaks down into 5 different sections that we're going to try to isolate, not just today, but we're going to look at those. But what I want you to notice is, notice there in chapter 9, verse 11, it begins, again I saw under the sun. So the word again is introducing to us a new topic. It is something else that he has learned under the sun or on the earth in this cursed world. If you remember back in chapter 1, verse 2, the preacher was invited to speak to the people of God about the meaning of life. And he determined that life actually is meaningless. And he gave us all those different lessons that I've already identified. And so now he's going to introduce another aspect of it, another teaching. So he says, again, I saw under the sun. Now notice, look at verse 13, chapter 9, verse 13. It begins, I have also seen this example of wisdom under the sun. So again, he's introducing something new. So verse 11 says, again, I saw under the sun. Verse 13, I have also seen under the sun. So this is another topic, another section that is divided by this phrase. If you look at chapter 10, verse 5, you see the same thing. It reads, there is an evil that I have seen under the sun. There's an evil that I've seen under the sun. He's again going to introduce another thought to us this morning. So these are grammatical ways in which we can see how the text is divided up and the different thoughts that he's going to give us. Now, another indicator of the division of sections is the style of writing. So if you look at the text beginning with verse 8 of chapter 10, all the way down to verse 4 of chapter 11, you notice there that it is now poetry. So he has switched from prose to poetry starting in 10 verse 8. And the poetry goes all the way to chapter 11 verse 4. And that section of poetry is made up of several little proverbs similar to what we find if we were reading the book of Proverbs. And then in chapter 11, beginning at verse 5, he returns to prose in verses 5 and 6, and then he gives us his closing thoughts. So this is how we're able to break the text up. So we have 5 sections, one beginning at verse 11 of chapter 9, the second part in chapter 9, verse 13, the third part in chapter 10, verse 5, the fourth part in chapter 10, verse 8, and then the fifth part, chapter 11, verses 5 and 6. Now, much of what is said in this whole section is very repetitive to the lessons he's already given to us. And that caused me all kinds of struggling in terms of figuring out how to present this text without being so repetitive to what has been said before. But needless to say then, that we're not going to look at every single verse, but we're going to try to bring out the new thoughts that the preacher is giving to us. So today I want to draw your attention just to 2 verses. And we're going to look at chapter 9, verses 11 and 12. So we're only going to look at those 2 verses. Now, in these verses, the preacher reminds us again that life in this world is unpredictable. That life in this world is unpredictable. But he doesn't stop there. He also tells us that in the unpredictability of life, that life is full of misfortune. Life is full of misfortune. Look at verse 11. Again, I saw, excuse me. Again, I saw that under the sun, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge. Verse 11 lists for us 5 lines of evidence to demonstrate that things do not always turn out the way we would presume. We would naturally think that the fastest runner would win the race. But look at what it says. The race is not always won by the fastest runner. Now, we know lots of situations in watching the Olympics and other things that just because you're the fastest runner does not guarantee that you're going to win the race. The runner may get they may fall or get a leg cramp or become overconfident near the end, um, and he begins to celebrate before he crosses the line, and before he knows it, another runner beats him. I mention that because that's a true life example. I also know that that runner will never do that again. But misfortune then makes the fastest runner sometimes lose the race. The battle is not always won by the strongest. A good example of that is the story of David and Goliath. Goliath was a big and strong and uh, soldier who won a lot of battles for the Philistines. And along comes David. Uh, I don't think he was a young boy, but I think he was a young man at that time. Some people may disagree, but I think it makes more sense that he's a young man towards his late teens, early 20s. But nevertheless, he comes along and he's a shepherd. He's not a trained warrior, and he stands there before Goliath without any armor, and he only has a slingshot and a few stones. So the battle didn't go to the strongest, but it went to the weakest that day. It was a misfortune for Goliath, but yet it was fortune for David. I mean, who could have predicted that to have happened? And then it says there in the verse, and bread doesn't always come to the wise. Bread doesn't always come to the wise. Now, here the word bread is talking about prosperity in the sense of having enough money to be able to provide for one's daily needs. And it says being able to be prosperous doesn't always come to the wise person. And the wise person there is a person who's a good worker, a hard worker. He may be referencing back to verse 10, where he talks about working hard for the Lord and living a wise life. And hopefully that would be able to provide our daily needs. But he says that just because you work hard and you work wise doesn't always guarantee that prosperity will come to you. Prosperity doesn't always come to those who work hard and work smart. And being intelligent, you look at the next parts, and being intelligent and educated does not mean that wealth or success or status will come your way. Along with the unpredictability of life is the truth that life is full of misfortune. One of the things that we often do in our lives, particularly in our day and age, where we have a world that puts a lot of focus and attention on getting an education and finding the best. An education will give you the best jobs, which will give you the best income, which will give you wealth and security. And those things are not necessarily true. And so we have to be careful, because when we don't get the education we wanted, when we don't get the degree that we wanted, when we don't get the job that goes with the degree, when we don't get the income, or when our income gets reduced, like it is for many people at this time, then we have a tendency then to think that we have been dealt a raw deal, and that's because we're looking at success in terms of achievement of the things that the world has to offer. And the preacher is reminding us here that there are no guarantees, but that doesn't come across as a negative to the person who trusts in God. In fact, when a misfortune comes our direction, we because we trust God, we actually discover that in the morning, if misfortune comes, that along with that misfortune comes God's joy. Now, I want you to look at the last phrase of verse 11. The last phrase of verse 11, it says, but time and chance happen to them all. So whether you are the strongest or the weakest, or the fastest or the slowest, um, or the wisest or a fool, it doesn't matter. Time and chance happens to them all. So this again is another concept that he talked about before when he talked about death, where he realized that it didn't matter who you were in terms of status or wealth or position or education, that death comes to everybody. We are all equal in that sense. And so here again, he tells us that time and chance happens to everyone. He's not talking there about luck or fate. He's actually talking about the ups and downs of time. There are good times and there are bad times. Literally, he says that the problem is that time and an incident or a timely incident comes to everyone. So he's referring back here to the poem that he wrote in chapter 3, where he says, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. Time to be born and a time to die. And a time for everything in between. So when he talks about time, he's actually talking about the plan of God. So he's saying that there are incidences that come to all of us that are within the plan of God. And there are chances. Now, God, what he's talking about when he uses the word chance, again, is he's talking about God's providence. They don't just come by chance, but they come because they are planned, and they are planned by God. So it is by godly chance or providence, whether or not that this timely incident is a time of victory or a time of misfortune. There again, he's referring back to chapter 9, verse 1, where he says that our deeds or our lives, the times of our lives, are in the hand of God. But whether there are times of love or times of hate, man does not know. Both are before him. So again, we don't know what tomorrow brings. It can be misfortune, and here, of course, he's emphasizing that misfortune happens. Now he's going to illustrate this for us and to help us to again understand exactly what he means. So there are times when the fastest runner wins the race, and there are times when the fastest runner loses the race. Everyone is subject to the ups and downs of time over which they have no control. What does he mean? Well, winning the race or the battle, having riches, influence, or status does not lie in having in our own wisdom, our prudence, our knowledge, our skill, or our strength. Having these things or not having these things depends on what God has planned and when God has planned it. So we know that our lives are planned out by God, and as we live and make decisions within that plan of God, that things happen to us. Sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad. And we need to, what he's wanting us to do is to learn to recognize that all of it comes from God, and to not let bad things interrupt us or cause us to worry or cause us to feel that something is wrong. You run as fast as you can. You fight as hard as you can. You work as hard as you can. You strive for a good education. And whether you succeed or not is in the plan of God. It's up to him. Our joy in life, our happiness in life is not dependent on us meeting our goals, but is dependent on our trust in God. I mean, who would have predicted back on January the 1st that a pandemic would strike and the world would be in lockdown? But this is a time planned by God. So a couple things here. God does everything deliberately. You know, when we talk about this, when we talk about the providence of God, it really comes under the heading of God's sovereignty. So in God's sovereignty means that He has the right and the power to exercise His will over His creation as the sovereign King. But within that sovereignty is His providence, and providence is is how He actually works His will and His plan out to us in our lives and the lives of people around us. We read about that in Ephesians chapter 1. In providence, there is a few other things. One of them is concurrence. He works in concurrence with the way that He has made us, and with our own decisions and our own personalities and our natures, so that He's planned us to fit to His plan, and He's going to put us in the most opportune place. And it may not necessarily be what we think it is. So God does everything deliberately. Psalm 115, verse 3. Our God is in the heavens. He does all that He pleases. He does things deliberately. And of course, God does as He pleases. Psalm 135, verse 6. Whatever the Lord pleases, He does, in heaven and on earth. God does all things according to His own eternal knowledge, power, and desire. Isaiah 46, verses 9 to 11. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose. I have spoken, and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed, and I will do it. Now I want you to take a look at verse 12. Verse 12. It reads, for man does not know his time. Like fish that are taken in an evil net, and like birds that are caught in a snare, so the children of man are snared at an evil time, when it suddenly falls upon them. So the fish is going along his life. He's swimming in the water, and he's eating the kelp and various other things that he finds to eat. And he does this every day, and then suddenly he is swooped up in an evil net. Now, the evil net tells us that the fish is going to be somebody's meal. The bird he talks about there is just flying around, and he lands on the ground and he begins feeding on the seeds, when suddenly he is caught in a trap. He is also going to be someone's meal. Life is unpredictable and full of misfortune. Neither the fish nor the bird planned on being trapped, nor did they plan their death. But look at the first part of verse 12 again. For man does not know his time. Hey, we don't know what God has planned for tomorrow or the next day or the day after that. And we especially do not know the day and time of our own death. And that's what he means there. He does not know the time of his death. It's that way for all of us. Suddenly death can overtake us. We may not suspect a thing. We're just going about our own business, and suddenly the net falls on us. We're caught in the snare, and life is over. The preacher here notes that no one knows what God has appointed in any situation or time. No one knows his appointed time to live or to die. No one knows the time that God has planned for them. This is one of the reasons that we need to be very cautious when we're quoting verses like Jeremiah 29, verse 11. A lot of people, of course, use this verse to say that God has a wonderful plan for you that is not evil, that's to give you a future, to give you a hope. And we're taking it out of its own context, but we have to be careful because this is a God revealing a plan to the children of Israel just before he judges them and removes them from the promised land. And he's promising them that after a period of time, he will restore them once again. So it doesn't always apply to us. It's true that God knows what he has planned for us, but we do not know what he has planned. We know that our deeds, as verse 1 says, our deeds are in the hand of God. Whether it is love or hate, good or bad, man does not know. Both are before him. We know that we can enter into good, we can enter into bad tomorrow morning. We don't know which one it will be, but we do know the one who has the plan. The preacher seems here to have forgotten to give us a conclusion or to give us the advice on how to handle life's misfortunes. And that's because he has tied it back to the conclusion of the section in verses 7 to 10. So if you look back at verse 7 reminds us that we are to make our own joy. We are to stop brooding over our problems. We are to stop uh, thinking that we are in control of what happens, and when it doesn't happen the way we think, that we think our life is out of control. Though those things are are not the way that a believer or a person who trusts in God should think. We are to remember that in all the bad of the world, God is in control. Good comes from God and suffering comes from God. And even when our plans fail, that comes from God. And misfortunes come from God. But we eat and drink and we go about living knowing that God has approved everything that is going to happen. Everything is for our good and for God's glory. We know that from Romans chapter 8. Essentially, verse 7 is saying that we are never out of the will and plan of God. And I want you to really think about that because it is a very startling statement to make that we are never out of the will and plan of God. So you cannot say that because of my sin or because of my suffering or because of the actions of other people or the loss of a job or a loss of pay or anything like that is coming because it's God's judgment upon us, but it is actually God's plan for us, and it is God's will. And if we are in God's will, then the joy will come with it. Verse 9 tells us to enjoy life with the ones you love. And verse 10 says to work hard, but don't be set back when misfortune comes tomorrow. I think he's telling us that when misfortune comes our way, that we should live for God in those moments. We're to live for God's glory, respond in a way that shows you trust God and you believe that even the losses are part of his good plan. Now, I'm not saying that everything will be easy for you. When misfortunes come our way, things can get very difficult. And the morning may bring sadness and sorrow and misfortune, but God sends his joy along with it. Just as Nehemiah said to the people, the joy of the Lord is your strength. And the psalmist in Psalm 30, verse 5 said, joy comes in the morning. Now, one of the great things that we can take comfort in and where we can find our joy is realizing that there are things that never change. And let me just give you 7 of them. I'm only going to list them, but I think you'll get the point. The first thing that hasn't changed is that God is in control. I was tempted to write that God is still in control, uh, but there's to me something wrong about the word still there. He is still in control, but he's still in control because he is in control, and that never changes. uh, when we say still, it may imply that at some point in the future he may not be, but that's not the case. What never changes is that God is in control. Secondly, God knows what is best. We learned that in a previous chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes, in chapter 7, that God knows what is best for us. We can think that we know what is best, but what comes our way at the hand of God is what is best. Third, God's plan hasn't changed. It's important for us to know that God had planned things from before the foundation of the world, and that God's plan never changes. Whatever happens to us or what happens in the world cannot change or influence God to change his mind. God knows what he's doing, and God will do exactly what he has planned to do. His plan hasn't changed. Fourthly, life is still a gift from God. The preacher tells us that on several occasions from chapter 2 right through to chapter 9, that life is God's gift to us. And all of life, the good and the bad that comes with it. The fifth thing that is constant and that hasn't changed is that a judgment day is still coming. Judgment day is coming. The sixth thing, hope is found only in Jesus Christ. Hope is found only in Jesus Christ. And that's good to know, because even though there is a day of judgment coming, we know that we will be delivered on that day uh, when Jesus comes again. Hope is found only in Jesus Christ. And the last thing that we learn from the book that hasn't changed is that hope brings joy to life. And that was the theme of our last message in Ecclesiastes. So Stephen Whitmer said this in an article that he wrote um, titled Things Haven't Changed. He says, unchanging realities produce unshakable Christians. Yes, we're scrambling and adjusting and hurting, but we have some precious truths to hold us steady in a topsy-turvy time. And now he's talking specifically about our day and age right now in this time of the coronavirus. But that's true. These things that have never changed make us unshakable Christians. And we need to learn to put our trust in the Lord. We should acknowledge that troubles will come and that we will face many trials. But we also should know that the Lord cares for you and that he is working all things out for the good of those who love him. Romans 8:28. And ultimately, our peace and our comfort can only come from putting our trust in the sovereign God with a sovereign plan and in the providence of God that makes it happen. Well, friends, if I can summarize it in one sentence, I would put it this way. Everything you do is the work of the Lord through you. And nothing you do or don't do for God is in vain. So find joy in the morning because God brings it with every timely event. Well, I hope God blesses you with that thought today and encourages your heart